So, good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of the Fisher Library's podcast series, Between the Pillars. My name is John Shoesmith, and I'm the outreach librarian at the Fisher. As you can see, we're still not back at the library. We continue to be under a work from home mandate from the province. So, for our health and safety, we'll continue to do this series remotely. We are hoping as we move into the spring that we might have some more latitude to do these again from inside the library, so actually between our pillars. But for now, we'll make do with this remote setting. For those that may be tuning into one of these for the first time, Between the Pillars is a bi-weekly video podcast series where we introduce you to a member of our library staff, who in turn will introduce you to some of our collections to highlight some of the treasures held within the walls of the library. To that end, I want to introduce librarian Danielle van Wagner in a segment that we've titled The Archives of Ordinary People. So I think it's a nice contrast to our previous episode that featured Lawrence Hill talking about his literary archives. For those that didn't see that episode is available on YouTube. Instead, we're focusing on archival material that maybe some of you won't be familiar with. It doesn't fall under the banner of literary archives, which is most of the archival material that researchers are familiar with at Fisher. So welcome, Danielle. It's great to have you here. Like everybody we have on here, we do like to learn something about the person that we're interviewing. So for those that have never met you, maybe you could tell us something about yourself. I think like many of us, you originally came to us as a student, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, that's correct. So I was actually lucky enough to be a participant in the iSchool Talent Program,
Right.
which actually gives students the opportunity to work in one of the University of Toronto libraries for a period of 2 years, so for their entire degree. And so I did that at the Fisher working on archival material.
I always like to ask people too, all the students that come in, do you actually remember your first project you worked on at Fisher?
I do. So I was given sort of two projects at the same time, and I sort of worked on them simultaneously.
Okay.
But it was actually a really great experience because I got to see both sides of what the Fisher's archival collections was. So on one side, I did Jay Millar and his independent press Book Thug, which very much falls under the sort of Canadian Writers' Archives. And on the other hand, I did the diaries and drawings of Benjamin Branfield, who was a sort of unknown British Navy soldier whose diaries we acquired.
Wow, two very different collections.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was
The
an
funny thing,
eye-opening experience.
the funny thing with Jay is Jay actually did a time at the Fisher Library as well. He was a practicum student at one time at the iSchool. So, and he did about 100 hours at Fisher. So, so did you go when you were at the iSchool? Did you have an archival focus primarily?
I did, yeah. So I that was the stream that I was in, and then I also decided, since I was so much enjoying working at the Fisher, I took a lot of classes also on the rare book side.
Okay. So in terms of your interest in archives, where does that come from?
I think I've just always been really interested in research. I've always been interested in sort of historical stories and finding out more about people. Um, I was a bit of a nerdy kid. I got super interested in genealogy when I was about 15.
Okay.
And I was that kid that was sort of at the county archives on Saturday with the 65-year-old women,
Right.
sort of poring over the historical documents. So it's definitely something I've always been really interested in.
What is your undergrad in, out of curiosity?
It's in art history and European studies.
Okay. Okay. And you're not from Toronto, is that right?
No, I got that at the University of Guelph.
Okay, interesting. So in terms of then some of the other projects you worked on subsequently from those, I mean, maybe you can just detail a couple of things that you worked on at Fisher, and also maybe give us some insight into how that prepared you for some of the work you're doing now.
Sure, absolutely. So probably throughout my time at the Fisher, I think I've probably processed about 50, 55 collections. And that really sort of runs the gamut. So I've done, Canadian poets, Canadian writers, um, philosophers, but then I've also done a lot more historical collections. I've worked on manuscripts, so photograph albums, diaries, and things like that. Um, and basically, just every single time you do a collection, you learn something new. You learn something new about our collections. And you also start to figure out how these fit into the rest of our collection. So how does this archival collection fit with this section of books? And how, does this piece of ephemera fit with this art collection? And that really allows you to start sort of making those connections And that's what sort of really prepared me, I think, to sort of start teaching and to be able to share our collections really effectively, was, grasping that knowledge of, getting into sort of the inner beings, as it were, of our collections.
That's one of the things that I like to talk about as well when I do any teaching of classes is to talk about those connections within our collections. It's not a disparate collection of just different materials. These things do sort of intertwine in so many ways.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Maybe you could let's go to the show and tell portion of this now, because I want to,
Okay.
especially because I want to emphasize the theme that we wanted to talk about, which is the archives of ordinary people. And just as a little preamble, actually, is that the very first thing I did at Fisher when I was a practicum student was exactly what we're going to be talking about, the archives of ordinary people. It was a collection that was a 19th century collection, primarily collected by former Fisher librarian Rachel Grover, and it was her great grandmother-in-law's archival papers that had a lot of letters, and it had a diary. So this is a topic that is close to me as well, because these are papers that I use all the time in my teaching as well. So I think it shines a light into the fact that, yes, we have Lawrence Hill's papers, we have Margaret Atwood's papers, but some of these other archival papers are just as important in terms of what we do at Fisher.
No, absolutely. And they have such potential to sort of personalize history and bring those events that happened however long ago sort of to the front and make them relatable. And I
Exactly.
think that's what's really important, of having these just voices of these regular people and how they lived their lives.
So let's see what you have.
All right. I'm going to share my screen.
Right.
All right, so I'm not going in any sort of particular order, and I've just selected a few to show for you today.
Great.
So the first is a selection of painted envelopes by Arthur Randall Ford. And so there's a really interesting story about this that I think is actually really powerful. So Arthur Randall Ford was born in England, and he was actually in the Navy in his early career. And in 1908, his son, Norman Randall Ford, moved to Canada from England, and he never returned home. But he maintained a very close relationship with his father, and every single Friday, from the time that Norman Randall Ford moved to Canada until his father died, his father sat down and wrote him a letter.
Right.
But what's really interesting is that we don't actually have the letters. We just have the envelopes, because every single Friday when Arthur sat down to write these letters, he made a painting on the envelope that he sent it to. Um, and what I really like about this is, when I started doing some research on Arthur and his son, was that I found out that all of these paintings had a meaning. So, when I looked into where they had lived and where Norman had spent his childhood, that isn't where Arthur lived when he was writing these letters. Instead, Arthur is sort of going back into Norman's childhood and showing all of these places that he had been, and sort of giving him this sort of idealized look of what his own childhood was and what England was. Um, and what I also find really interesting about it is that it almost always seems to be summer. So you know that he's not making them from life, he's making them from his own memory. So
How many of those letters? How many of those do we have?
So we actually have 108. So we don't have the entire set, but I do believe that he did make one every single Friday. But we have a lot, and they date from between 1908 to 1921. So we go to the next one. So for example, this one on the left, which is Old Tollgate, Kennington, which is where Norman grew up, you can see that it's actually made in the middle of December, but it's clearly a beautiful English summer day there. So I feel like he was really sort of drawing on that idea of nostalgia and reminiscing, and sort of, sending a snapshot from home, as it were, with every single letter. And that would be the first thing that his son would see when, he pulled it out of the mail.
I've been to England in December. It's nothing like that.
No, it certainly isn't. All right, so the next one, when I mentioned before that I had done the work of Benjamin Branfield as my first collection, and it always made such a sort of statement on me, and it's always one of those collections that I've come back from, because it was just such a fascinating introduction into working on archives and what is available in archives. So Benjamin Branfield lived a very interesting life. So he was born in 1822. He was from a member of the sort of aristocratic family in England, and he joined the Navy, and he sort of sailed the colonial world, as it were. Um, and what we received from his collections is we received his diaries for about 52 years. So he started writing them when he was about 21 years old, and he wrote literally until the day of his death um, in 1899. And what those diaries show is they really show the evolution of a person who's living through a very interesting part of history. So, they start with just sort of an everyday account of his day, while he's in the Navy. But then as we go on, you really start to sort of see the growth of his interests, what's important to him, what matters to him. So this one I absolutely love. So he puts a lot of ephemera into his diary. So this one actually says, "Scrap of trousers worn by me on my wedding day." And you can actually see the scrap there that he's put in there. And there's similar things throughout. So there's, locks of his children's hair. There's, you know, programs of performances he went into. Um, and then throughout the time, he really becomes a part of that generation in which the aristocratic life really ends for him. So, he leaves the manor house that his family has lived in for centuries, and he actually immigrates to New Zealand completely alone. He leaves his family behind, um, and he really starts to sort of take over his own interests. So he becomes very religious. He becomes very interested in painting, in collecting uh, specimens of flowers, botany samples, and you can see all of that in his journals and his diary entries, and it's so fascinating.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about kind of the research value that something like this would hold to a scholar or even to just a member of the general public that's interested in this period of time of history.
No, absolutely, because what things like this do is they show what the perspective was at the time. So, you know, Branfield writes a lot about what's going on in the world around him and what his own opinions are about it. And that's something that you can't really sort of get in the history books of, for an everyday person, how did they view these events that were going on? Were they important to them? Did it matter? Did it make an impact in their lives? And diaries like this really show that. So I think that would certainly be of interest, especially to sort of social historians, which is sort of a very up and coming, I think, area of research that's seen a lot more interest in diaries like these.
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to read some of this stuff in a book. It's something else to actually hold the material yourself and get it from that primary source.
Absolutely, yeah. And to sort of be able to just glimpse into a person's life, literally.
Exactly.
All right, so our next one that we're going to look at, this one, it's not much to look at itself, but the actual content is fascinating. So this is actually the Raster Workhouse papers. And what's interesting about this collection was that I discovered this collection in our backlog. So, every special collections library, I think, has a backlog, which is sort of material that gets put on a shelf and maybe doesn't get seen for a couple years or maybe a couple of decades.
Yes,
So this
usually a
one,
couple of decades.
yeah, absolutely, and that fits par for the course. So this one was purchased by the library in 1994, and I processed it last year. So it's been waiting down there for a while, but it was well worth it. So what I absolutely love about this collection is that, of course, everybody knows the workhouses in England, and that's where sort of poor people were institutionalized, and sort of accordingly that it was for their own good and things like that. But so this is a selection of papers, and it's quite a lot of papers, and it dates from about 1784 to about 1845. And what it's sort of advertised is that it's the correspondence of the overseer of the poor for a certain area in Yorkshire, England. Um, but when you start getting into it and you start looking at the words themselves, it's way more than that, because um, what actually you have is that you have people who were maybe going to be institutionalized in workhouses, who were put into workhouses, or who were given support by this overseer of the poor to stay out of the workhouses. And you actually have two sides of the story. So you have the overseers talking about them, but then occasionally you also have them talking about themselves.
Mm.
whether it be in the account on the left-hand side, which is actually a written account from 1790 of a man named Abraham Dyson. And basically what he does is he goes through every single aspect of his life here. So he says where he was born, he says where he apprenticed, what his father did, where he moved, why he moved, where he lived, what his house looked like, every little detail, which is something that you really can't find a lot of. And I think it's so interesting. And then on the other side, we actually have a letter that's, so the overseers had been talking about Elizabeth and William Brooks a lot. And then so we actually have a letter written from Elizabeth Brooke into the overseer in which she tells him that her husband is, off living with his mistress, and so that she can't afford her rent, so he needs to help her. And there's all sorts of examples like this. And it's just sort of a really fascinating snapshot into sort of history of the sort of lower classes that we don't get to hear their voices a lot.
It's kind of sad too when you think about maybe the future of history when a lot of these chronicles or diaries are not being kept on paper. And so in some ways, the electronic world, it becomes a little more ephemeral. So that's why some of these, 17th, 18th, 19th century documents are so fascinating to so many of us, because we may not have some of those things in the 21st century.
No, that's absolutely true. And I think about that a lot, actually. And I think actually going on to my next one, that's actually something that I've been thinking a lot about World War II. So a lot of the World War II vets are passing on, or even their children are. And there's a lot of material that's sort of living in basements and attics. And I think a lot of people think, oh, nobody wants this. This isn't really important to anybody, but it really, really is. And having those voices is so important to collect and to keep, so that we can continue telling the story of what actually happened, as the years go by. And I think that this is a great example. So one of the areas that I really enjoy working with is both World War I and World War II. And this is a great diary. So it's by, let me make sure I get the name right. He's got a very long name. Ian Cameron Monroe Place. There we go. So this diary was actually a diary that was given out by the Red Cross to soldiers who were placed in POW camps during World War II. Mm-hmm. So this actual physical diary you'll see a lot, but it's what's actually written on the inside. And what I find very, very interesting about this one is that while, Place is the only one who actually writes in it, it really shows that it was a group effort. So he starts off by writing out these sort of samples of all of the people that he meets in the camp. And they're quite, I suppose you could say they're quite honest. So for example, you see Robert G. McGibbon here, and you sort of see his whole story about being in the military and, his brothers in the Navy. And then, it's just like small personal details that you would get if you were talking to someone. So right. Family used to go to Oxford Lake, for the summer times. He was expelled from Montreal High. He intends to leave the army. He's engaged to a girl from Montreal. So all of those sort of little details that he would have got because they had lots of time to sit around and sort of just talk. And this other one of sort of D. Monaghan, tall, thin, untidy mop of hair, very quiet, fond of poetry, clever at sketching landscapes, inclined to be lazy where his own comfort is concerned, but always is ready to volunteer for any jobs affecting the room or company. Unmarried.
It really brings people to life.
It really does. And what's interesting that as you go through this, even more so, you learn, what they were talking about in these camps and what they were sort of sitting around doing. And that's what's fabulous about this is that, so you can just sort of imagine them that, in the evening, they're in these bunkhouses and Place has got his diary open and they're talking about probably all the things they miss from back home. So there's entire pages dedicated to all the restaurants they liked going to. So this is a complete listing of all the restaurants in Soho, with sort of reviews. So like Bertinelli's at the bottom there, rather cheap and crowded, but a jolly good place for quantity. And then on another page, we have all of the wines. So they're all sitting there thinking, oh, I'd love a glass of wine.
Mm.
What kind of wines do I like? And on another page, they go over, all their favorite recipes and all their favorite sort of treats that their moms would make them from back home. So it's just such a personalized sort of thing of this entire group of men who are stuck. And you always hear about prisoners of war camps, but you never really think what went on, in the downtime. You sort of hear about the hard labor or the sickness, but you don't hear about things like this.
And this is why we tell people, we reiterate to people all the time, if you do have this material, as you say, hidden down in your basement, let us know about it, because it finds a welcome home in a library like ours.
Absolutely. These are things that we love to collect and we
Mhm.
love to keep and we love to share with other people. So,
Mhm.
all right. So my last one is, we're moving forward a little bit. And because, one of the questions I sometimes get when I'm teaching is, how do you come across this material? How does it make its way to you? And the most part, it is donated. But not everybody thinks that their personal material is worth keeping or worth giving, or that they'll even seek us out. So this one I thought was a really interesting collection. So this is the collection of Elizabeth Brady, which we actually got last year. And we collected her works as part of our Canadian Writers papers. So she's a fairly well-known mystery writer, and she did a lot of other writing on the side. But she was also a great collector of her own life. She kept every single letter that she ever received. She collected, she saved the letters from her parents. So her collection actually starts with her father writing a letter to her mother on the day she was born.
Wow.
So she has just kept everything. And what I was found really interesting when I was going through her collection, that it's really a snapshot of, a young girl growing up in Canada in the 1950s and the 1960s. And of course, one of the big things about growing up in Canada at that time was Expo 67. And she has such a wonderful snapshot of that event. So it starts, we've got on the left, we've got her passport. So when you went to Expo 67, you got this passport, and every single time you went to one of the nation's pavilions, you got a stamp. So she kept that, of course. But what was also interesting was that all of the writing that went on between her and her friends and her parents about Expo. So she, we don't have the messages that she sent, but we have, the postcards sent by her friends. It's like, oh, I went to Expo, and I went with this person, and I'm writing from here. And all of these, great descriptions of everything that they did. And then, of course, because she also has her parents' letters, so we actually have the letter that she wrote to her parents about going to Expo, and then we have the letter that her parents wrote back about having visited. So you're even getting the sort of different perspectives of different generations visiting there, which is, maybe people think that Expo 67 wasn't that long ago, but it's really important to sort of keep these histories, because, one day it is going to be a long time from now, and having these perspectives is going to be so important.
Well, being from Montreal, these documents mean something to me. So
Yeah, so that is what I have to share today.
that's great. It's interesting because do you ever think of the things that you would still hoping to get, like hoping that donors might think about, donating some of these more archives of ordinary people?
Oh, absolutely. Like there's just so many areas that I would be interested in. So definitely World War I and World War II are always something that I love to hear about. We get a lot of collections of people traveling, and I think that those are so wonderful. And I really just like to get sort of perspectives that aren't perhaps maybe the norm or aren't the established. So what were women thinking, sort of what were lower social classes thinking. Sort of a diary of a lower class person would just be fantastic, because because of the situations of circumstances, quite frequently maybe they weren't literate, or they weren't keeping those things, or they weren't able to write diaries, but they do happen occasionally, and when they do, it's just such a fantastic find. So that's something that I think about quite a bit as well.
Yeah, that material is sorely lacking in so many archival collections. Those are the untold stories. I mean, most of the stories are told by people of money and people with power, but it's some of the more marginalized stories that we're really hoping to seek out, because that's important to understand for a greater understanding of our history.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's something that we've had the opportunity just recently to do with our Black History exhibition, which we were able to sort of delve into that a little bit and sort of explore some of our collections a little bit more.
Yeah, I should mention that Danielle's sort of been leading our charge on our online exhibitions that we've been really sort of ramping up since the pandemic started last year. So you can check out all of those they're linked from our main website. So take a look at those. So Danielle, thank you for this. This has been really great. I think it's been a nice insight into into some of the, we always talk about the Tier A collections at Fisher, but these are just as important as well, because they shine a light on the fact that we collect more than just Atwood. We collect more than just these great literary writers. We collect, as you say, the archives of ordinary people.
Yeah, absolutely. It was wonderful to be here and speak about it.
So thanks everybody for joining us. We'll have another episode in 2 weeks' time. So please tell your friends about us. You can look at all the past episodes we've done on our YouTube channel, and we look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks.
All right, bye.